It's still morning for them.
Oh, that's true, yeah. So, welcome. My name is Trish Everett. I was a student in the We the People program 9 years ago, and have since taught and coached my own teams. And I now teach American government and psychology in South Florida. I'll show you my team.
And hi, my name is Tandy McConnell. I served as professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina for about 20 years. But right now I'm teaching high school students very much like you. An honor to be here with you.
Hi, I'm John Cousins. I remember you all from yesterday. Great job. Congratulations making it to the final round here. And I'm an entrepreneur and investor from New Mexico. I'm looking forward to another wonderful dialogue.
Would you introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Hello, my name is Haley Sato, and the philosopher that influences my view on government the most is Socrates, for his belief that education is a prerequisite and the greatest safeguard for justice.
Hi, I'm Lachlan Bailey, and the philosopher that has influenced my view on government the most is John Locke, for his view that the end of law is neither to abolish nor to restrain, but only to preserve and enlarge freedoms.
Hi, my name is Emily Brestel, and the philosopher that influenced my view on government is Montesquieu, for his advocacy for individual rights and the separation of powers.
Hello, my name is Jay Simon, and the philosopher that influenced my view on government the most is Machiavelli, for his distinction between public and private morality. And on behalf of Unit 1, our advisor, Gretchen Wolfang, and Tahoma High School, representing the state of Washington, thank you for judging.
Fantastic. All right, so as you probably surmised, today we're looking at question number 1. And I'll read that full question, then we'll get to hear from you a little bit. John Trenchard wrote in 1721, so that to know the jurisdiction of governors and its limits, we must have recourse to the institution of government and ascertain those limits by the measure of power which men in the state of nature have over themselves and one another. To what extent is a constitution a limit on government and or a limit on the people themselves? How does the U.S. Constitution reflect this tension between limits on government and people? And what is the appropriate balance between limited government and empowered government today? You may begin.
I hope we have once again reminded people that man is not free unless government is limited. Ronald Reagan.
The extent to which a constitution is a limit on both the people and the government is the extent to which it limits itself, creating an inverse parity of privileges and duties between the two.
Aristotle, in his Politics, defines this thought within two core values that arise in any society. One is the obedience of the citizens to the laws, the other is the goodness of the laws which they obey.
Under a constitution, the government restricts its own authority in exchange for serving the people.
Solidified by Thomas Aquinas in On Laws, Morality, and Politics. Just as a shepherd of a flock seeks the good of their flock, every ruler, the good of the people, subject to him.
If the people are subservient to the government as the flock is to the shepherd, then it is the duty of the government to provide for them as the Constitution allows.
The social contract, through our Constitution, requires that the people relinquish a portion of their freedoms in exchange for true liberty.
While it is up to each society to decide what limits they establish in their constitution, there is a natural domain of rights, which under no circumstances can be limited.
This is detailed in Trenchard's Cato 60. No man can give to another what is none of his own, and what is in its own nature, inseparable from himself.
The importance of natural rights is illustrated by the state of nature, as Trenchard emphasized that by virtue of existence, certain rights were inalienable even by consent, and thus could not be restricted by any institution or individual.
With respect to individual liberty and the preservation of a just society, a constitution reflects this tension by balancing the scale between minimal intervention and necessary restriction.
As Thomas Jefferson wrote, a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement.
Understanding that freedoms cannot be guaranteed unless protected, Thomas Jefferson warned against the dangers of minimal and excessive government intervention, citing that in an ideal republic, the coexistence of self-regulation and legal obedience is necessary.
This is reflected in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which outlines that bills of attainder may not be passed. In preventing discriminatory legislation, which historically targeted minorities in Britain, it stands to ward off future corruption.
Eminent domain, found in the Fifth Amendment, empowers the government, and thus inversely limits the people, allowing for the expropriation of private property for public use.
Such can be seen in application in cases like Kelo v. City of New London, in which private property was taken to revitalize a distressed economy, even though this was not a blighted area.
The constant strain between the American people and authority has been a vital part of our history and continues to play a part in limiting government today.
The proper balance between an empowered and limited government can only be found in moderation, modified by the will of the people.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract is built on one foundation, that it is the divine right of the people to decide what liberties to give out to their government. However, due to humanity's vulnerability to conditioning, there are two extremes which must be avoided: tyranny and anarchy.
As Sophocles said, there is no greater evil than anarchy, wherein no laws exist.
Thomas Hobbes described life without government, and thus life without laws, as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, emphasizing that regulation is actually a prerequisite to liberty.
However, government power in excess is the catalyst of its failure, creating the other extreme of tyranny.
Aristotle, further in his Politics, describes tyranny as the compound of oligarchy and democracy in their most extreme forms. It is therefore most injurious to its subjects.
It is extremism that is the greatest threat to both common and individual good. As Jeremy Bentham writes in The Principles of Morals and Legislation, tyranny and anarchy are never far apart.
In fact, they're so close. John Milton writes, anarchy is the sure consequence of tyranny, for no power not limited by the law can ever be protected by it.
So, while it is the job of the Commonwealth to decide the proper balance between a limited and empowered government, they must do so within the domain of tyranny and anarchy. The balance, when within these bounds, will serve the society and the people most effectively. Thank you.
So you talked about this range of liberty and power. Is it possible to have too much democracy?
Absolutely. As seen in Plato's Republic, he warns the public of direct democracy. He takes an empty storefront and tells the people to imagine both a doctor and a candy salesman looking to buy it. To the uneducated public, the candy salesman would look like a better option, but the doctor is the one who would help the society in the long run. This direct democracy of people being controlled by mob mentality ends up being a danger to the liberty instead of a beneficial term.
To build on this, taking this from theory to actual application, we see that this is cyclical in history. For example, the rise and fall of the Roman Republic and the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. They were back to back because when Augustus took power, he believed that he would never put, he was basically in reaction to the issues that democracy was causing. It was far too direct, and there was a mob mentality that was happening, and it basically devolved to anarchy. However, again, it rose to an empire, and then after that back into a republic, because these issues were just cyclical.
We can also see the issues of a lack of a strong government within the Ethiopian civil war currently. Because there's not a strong government, we've seen the rise of these factions that were warned about in the Federal Papers, and so that is what's fueling the current civil war within that country.
Inside America, the founders explicitly thought of this, with James Madison being quoted as saying that the purpose of our representative democracy is to provide a medium for which the refined and enlarged views of the publics from their democracy would be passed through so that these elected citizens would be able to use their wisdom to best discern the true course of the nation. So it includes here that democracy on its own would be fallible, but through our representative democracy, we're able to mitigate the effects.
Let's go back to John Trenchard. Can you tell me more about him? What are his political assumptions and what are the sources of his political thinking?
John Trenchard was much alike the same thought of John Locke, which in fact that he thought that every man has natural rights that come to him without any sort of justification or any sort of donation from any government. They're innate to him and everyone around him.
In the Cato letters, as he writes, he advocates for the First Amendment, as we see today. He advocates for this freedom of religion, freedom of speech. He believes that this is a natural right of his citizens, and that they should be allowed to freely express how they want, and the government should never limit that.
Considering the historical context of this, most of his criticisms arose from the abusive nature of the parliament where he was standing in Britain. The issues with the legislative branch led him to want to preserve the individual liberties of the citizens to inversely check the government.
Thank you.
You talked about Trenchard's thinking from recent historical texts and recent Enlightenment philosophers, but he called his Cato's letters. I'd like to talk a little bit about who was Cato and some classical influences.
The Cato letters were much akin to the Federalist Papers, in which they were critiquing the current systems of government that he experienced. So just as the Federalist Papers were critiquing the Articles of Confederation, in which they were trying to advocate for the adoption of the new Constitution, the Cato letters were largely, like my colleague Misato said earlier, critiquing the systems of the Parliament and the monarchy as in power inside of England at that moment in time.
The classical influences of the word Cato, or the pseudonym Cato, was actually because, one, him and his partner did not want to use his real names for fear of basically abuse from the government that they were critiquing, but also the idea of Cato was to infer a sense of martyr that was originally from the influences of the classical literature that was pulled from.
So in many of the systems you mentioned, the institutions that help to allow government power to function without violating rights, often they produce gridlock. Is this a bug or a feature?
Well, as Jefferson said, Congress was supposed to be the cooling saucer of nature. It was most intuitively a deliberative body. The fact that gridlock exists and the fact that we haven't abolished it or made more efforts to abolish it is in fact because it can be helpful to the nation, as it prevents the whims of the society passing too quickly and thus creating concrete foundations that could not be easily swayed later when the society continues to change.
Disagreeing with my colleague Misato, I believe that gridlock can be harmful to our country. As Plato said, opinion is the medium between knowledge and ignorance. Oftentimes people take this opinion and not further it to the side of knowledge. They just check the Republican or the Democrat box on their election ballot, not actually caring what the views are. This gridlock can prevent important legislation from being passed just because people are so set in their ways and not willing to understand and have this civil discourse about what the other side may believe.
Montesquieu, who wrote The Spirit of the Laws just before the French Revolution, noted that one of the most important things in any government is checks and balances and separation of powers. And because of a lack of gridlock or a lack of a slow deliberative body, that's what led to the need for the French Revolution. And so we can see that because of the systems we have in place, it's important to have this gridlock, or at least this slow deliberative body in order to ensure that we don't fall into the same issues that the French government did.
Slightly disagreeing with my colleague, Mr. Simon, I believe that Congress is, while it's supposed to be a deliberative body, gridlock has gone too far. This is supported in America today, as a recent Pew Research Center poll found that up to 80% of Americans hope for something in their government to change. However, gridlock is the exact opposite of that, as Congress, as defined in Article 1, is the legislative body of the government. So any legislation that defines America or would change America comes out of it. But this gridlock is inherently in opposition to this and is not satisfying most Americans.
So we keep talking about decisions and principles and ideas of people who've been dead for 200 or 300 years. Should we still be governed by dead people? Is this what we are doing?
I personally believe that while these people may be dead, they are among some of the finest people that have ever walked the earth, as they have given all that we need to change this Constitution that they laid out for us inside of this Constitution. In Article 5, the amendment process can be found, whereas we have had over 26 or 27 amendments passed through that. But furthermore, in that same Article 5, the rules for a new constitutional convention, in the event that our current Constitution does not serve the Americans as they see fit, can be laid out so that way the American people can best discern their next future.
I would say that there are certain aspects of people who have been dead for hundreds of years, like you said, that we should take and some that we should leave. For example, Socrates, who the founders drew heavy inspiration from, while did criticize democracy, he also had some very poor views about the type of people who should be able to vote, saying that it should only be the intellectuals and the philosophers that should be able to control the republic. And so we take inspiration from the good aspects of them, but leave behind the bad ones.
As philosopher Spinoza said, if you want the present to be different than the past, study the past. We must understand these dead people's views in order to understand how to change them with their times. They may not have been perfect, as my colleague Mr. Simon addressed, but they still had these founding ideals of our nation. And these founding ideals that we still carry with us in our Constitution are vital to the success of the American democracy today.
Spinoza actually goes on further to say that people believe themselves to be free because they are aware of their actions, but not the background knowledge or the background influences of them. In the same way, I believe that we have to be aware of the societal influences on these people, considering, for example, that the framers were mostly basically the equivalent of aristocrats. They were land-owning upper class. And for this reason, for the same reason that we can view the Constitution with a modernist approach, we can look at these philosophers as well. For example, even Foucault, who was about 200 years ago, condemned the same ideas that capital punishment currently brings controversy now.
what do we have that ensures the peaceful transfer of power to political opposition?
I think this is a very pressing question given the recent involvement of January 6th, where we can see that when a certain group of people felt that their votes were not being counted and that the transition of power was not going as the Constitution lays out, they thought to hold it accountable. Now, while I fundamentally disagree with the motivations for the uprising and the storming of the Capitol, I think that the people do offer the safest and most sureguard protection against the peaceful transition of power, as the only authority, as defined by Rousseau, that the president or the government has is the one that we give them as the people through the social contract theory.
And in our Constitution, we have subtle protections that allow for this transfer to be easier. As seen in Article 6, Section 3, the religious test, the next ruler does not have to abide as the same religion as the past one. There's no specific standard of religion that the president has to be. This subtle thing can just help this transfer of power be easier between presidents.
So, with this focus on popular sovereignty and the people being a check on the government, there are segments of the population that are not eligible to vote. In what other ways could they express dissatisfaction or a check on government power if they are too young, incarcerated, not citizens? How could they express that without voting?
Well, in the same way that our republic gives us rights, we are also given responsibilities. For example, civic virtue and civic participation can take in other actions besides just voting. For example, I was one of the hundreds of thousands to send a letter to my representative in opposition to the Willow Project that was recently proposed by the Biden administration, which is just one way that there is no age restriction to reaching out to your representatives to even just ask them questions about their policies and what they are pushing for in Congress or the Senate.
Although not being able or eligible to vote, personally, I'm the president of Washington's Air Army National Guard Youth Program, where I teach 7,000 to 8,000 military youth on how to become US citizens and practice their civic virtue throughout their lives.
I think the best example of this is what we are doing here today. I mean, there's students all across the country who may not even be eligible to vote, but sat here today and gave this had this conversation about civics and about exploring more about politics. So.
Adding on to my colleague, Mr. Simon, as Plato said, if you do not take interest in the affairs of your government, then you are doomed to live under a rule of fools. Even people who are too young or incarcerated who don't have the right to vote, that doesn't stop them from understanding, from learning about what their government is and what they stand for. And if they disagree with that, there's social media outcries, there's letters to appointed officials. And they can utilize these ways that the Constitution has provided them, utilize their First Amendment, and enact change in their government.
Excellent. This was fabulous. I always think it's a good sign when I'm a little sad time was called. I love to keep chatting. And clearly you know your content inside and out, can recognize multiple aspects of these nuanced issues. And when you pointed out that what we're doing here today is the essence of civic virtue and education, it definitely didn't give me goosebumps or anything. It's fine. So fantastic work, very nicely done.
Absolutely wonderful discussion. You went deep into detail about a great many things and people. You won the prize for mentioning first mention of Spinoza, who is an important philosopher who tends to get ignored in these things far too often because he is difficult to read. Then so is John Pritchard. I've been trying to do that, and it's like, yeah, never mind. But very nicely done, very well discussed with a great deal of depth. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to echo them, very impressive. And also, you were the first one to mention John Milton, who's one of my favorite poets and also a great political thinker. And so I thought that was really wonderful. And I have to ask you, yesterday you started with each with in foreign language, a quote. What was that?
We figured you wanted to hear something different. We changed them because we have two of the same judges, so they've already heard the different languages. So we decided to give you a different take on it.
What were the languages? Was it all the same? Or?
They were all within the philosopher's language. So Montesquieu was in French, Marcus Aurelius was in Greek and Latin.
We went back to the original documents, and we didn't use Google Translate. And so we went back to the original documents, and we found the language, and then we learned how to say it.
The idea was that yesterday's represented our private morality, whereas the interests today were more of our public public morality.
Excellent. We're trying to- that's really-
Very
Thank you.
nicely done, thank you very much.